Thanks, Ira, and thank you, everyone, for coming out on a sunny day. Actually, it's kind of interesting because it's been raining, and I think, okay, maybe more people will come because, nothing else to do on a rainy day. But today was beautifully sunshine-filled, and so thank you for coming. Thanks also to Arts Wednesday and the organizers. I think it's a great idea to have this kind of lecture series. When Ira asked, can you come talk about something, I just thought, well, this is a subject that I really care about. As Ira mentioned, I'm a Vancouverite, which in Vancouver right now is actually quite rare because it seems like almost everybody is from somewhere else. And I was born here in 67. Oh, all of you guys are native Vancouverites? Okay, so you see, I'm pulling in the Vancouverite crowd. That's good. But it is, as you've looked around the city, a place where not only people come from outside Canada, but also from outside Vancouver, from every other part of Canada to move to. So what I wanted to do is just talk about basically our future as a half Chinese city, and a half Asian city may be more accurate, because we're not going to be half Chinese for a little while, but we're already basically a half Asian city in terms of the heritage of who lives here. And so to think about where we're at and where we're going, but as a historian, think about it from the perspective of the past. And I'll explain sort of what that means through the talk. I think the subtitle, Representing Vancouver's Pacific Past and Future, is to me about moving away from a myth of who we are that just doesn't work anymore. And for those who maybe grew up here, you'll have a clearer idea than, say, those who've arrived more recently about Vancouver and the way Vancouver thought of itself, say 25, 30, 40 years ago, in a very different way. And when I was young, I won't tell you exactly how old I am, but when I was younger, I think it was still a city in transition. So I'll talk about that transition that occurred in basically in the 1970s in the city, but also go back 125 years. So, first thing, this is from Census Canada, 2006. I didn't do the work on this. People who count up things and use the census did it, but it's a nice little map. And I don't know if you can see it, but it shows the top 10 places of birth for those new immigrants to Canada, according to the 2006 census. And visually, you can see that the circles represent, more people than little circles. Big circle, lots of people, less people. So if you look at it, the top 10 places of birth, People's Republic of China is number 1, 155,105. Number 2 is India, 129,140. Philippines, 77,880. Pakistan, 57,630. Number 5 is the first non-Asian country, the United States of America, and actually it drops, 38,770. So quite a, relative to the top 4, it's dropping down fast. If you actually look, the first European country or nation is Romania at number 7 with 28,000. And the United Kingdom, the traditional source for Canada in terms of immigration and migration for most of its history, is number 9, just above, barely just above, 25,655, which is only about 300 or so above Colombia. Okay. So, just thought I would open up with that as a way of, showing you that Canada overall is now a place that is overwhelmingly attractive to people crossing the Pacific. The top 4 sending regions. And if you look at it not just in ranking ordinal order, but in fact in the actual total numbers, and you added up the first 3, China, India, Philippines, 155 is rounded. I'm in arts, so I'm not a math major, but 155, 130, that's about 280, plus another 70, that's about 350,000. That dwarfs the rest. Okay. And in fact, those top 3 sending countries send the majority of our new immigrants in terms of the total number. Okay. So what I've done is I've actually taken the title page that you just saw first, which was on a blank white background, and put it onto a map a satellite image of the Pacific. And I'm doing that very deliberately because visually, what I'm trying to say is we're here. Oh, it's not very, oh, sorry, it's not very clear. But if you kind of see the greenish blob over there, it's North America. We're on the west edge of North America, and the Pacific is that vast blackness in the middle. And let me see if I can adjust the contrast at all. Well, one of the things about revisioning where we are, both in Vancouver, and I think to use a term that I and others have used a lot, is Pacific Canada is about reorienting our future and our history. Pacific because, again, most of what I learned in grade 5 and grade 10 when we did history and social studies is that Canada was settled east to west by people who got off the ship in Halifax. Right? And then they crossed the country on the Trans-Canada Railway, and they got to the west last. They got to BC last. The problem with that is that when Confederation occurred in 1867 and when 1871 BC joined the other colonies to create the Confederation of Canada, there were already Chinese here, and there were already First Nations and Aboriginal peoples here. And so the idea that Canada has two founding peoples, the English and the French, is in fact a distortion of what actually happened. It comes, in fact, from not that long ago. I mean, if you think of the founding peoples idea, and really where it achieved prominence was in the late 60s, early 70s, as a new Canadian identity was being built out of bilingualism and biculturalism, and the idea that really Quebec and Ontario were the founding colonies, and the rest sort of got added later. One of the things I'd like to push today, just provocatively, is that there were a lot of founding peoples, if you want to go that route. There were First Nations who were already here when trans-Pacific and transatlantic migrants came. And there were Chinese who, let me put it this way, who built the transportation system that allowed a lot of the people to come from the East Coast, and why? Everybody knows this, the Chinese helped build the CPR. But they also helped build the western leg of the railways that connected California to the East Coast. They also built the western legs of the Oregon railways. They built the railways on the west coast of North America. The reason why is they were already here. It wasn't because they were cheaper. It was because you could get here by water much more efficiently than you could get here by land. Just if you imagine 1870, let's say, you want to get here from the East Coast. Well, by that time, you can take a railway in California, or from New York, say, over to California. But 1860, you'd have to get in a wagon train. You'd have to start when the spring rains basically stopped. You'd get over to a place called Independence, Missouri. You'd buy things like salted pork and dry, bread and stuff like that. And then you would take 3 months to cross in a wagon train across territory of people who were kind of hostile to you because you're crossing their territory. And finally, if you got to the Rockies or the Sierra Nevadas, you had to cross. If you waited too long, it was easy crossing the prairies and you didn't have to deal with mud. But if you waited too long, you'd get stuck up in the mountains and you have to eat each other. All right, the Donner Party, the very famous set of people who get stuck in the mountains and then resort to cannibalism. It's actually inordinately expensive to go across land. The easiest way to get to the west coast of North America before the railroads was to go all the way around the world by water. Was to, say, leave London, go around the Cape of Good Hope, around, stop at Hong Kong, and then get to Victoria or San Francisco after you've picked up a bunch of Chinese along the way in Hong Kong. So that's why the Chinese were already here. And I say this because it's a way of putting us back into a world, in fact, where the Chinese were here building a kind of makeshift society with Aboriginal people and European arrivals. And that was what BC was. And that's what BC was up until the moment of Confederation and beyond, in fact, all the way to the moment when the railways finished. And I'll just pause that for a sec. Okay. I'm going to throw out the new Canada. There is a new Canada. And then I'm going to connect it up with that old Canada I just talked about. The new Canada, the most recent Canadian census shows metropolitan Vancouver has a population of 2 million, or about 100,000. So 2,100,000 people, roughly. Out of which 40% are immigrants, which means they came from somewhere else outside Canada. 40%. The overwhelming majority of those, quote, immigrants are Asian. Remember the map just before. For the city itself of Vancouver, so the core region, downtown, where we are right now, visible minorities make up 51% of the population of 571,000. And 25% of BC's population is visible minorities. Now, that's not all Asian, but it's mostly, in a place like BC, people of Asian descent. Overwhelmingly Asian, with 10% of BC's population being ethnic Chinese, according to the census. So 1 in 10 of British Columbians overall are ethnic Chinese. For comparison, just to let you see the other top cities, Montreal is 2% Chinese, 2% South Asian, and Montreal is about 16% visible minority versus our 51%. That's where we get the sort of half Asian, half Chinese, whatever you want to call it, idea or metaphor. But this new Canada is also, in a strange, ironic way, a return to an older Pacific Canada, the one that I sort of started talking about. And now I'm going to explain just what happened and why it is that there's this weird period between. Pacific Canada, I throw that out not to say, oh, this is a new way to say Western Canada. Pacific Canada is highlighting how Canada itself is changing, and its cities in particular, and in Vancouver and Toronto very much in particular, are changing. We are oriented already into a world where trans-Pacific immigration and migration flows are changing our urban demography. It doesn't take much walking around Vancouver to see that. It also, of course, signals changes in depths of engagement economically and through networks. Even if you're not yourself from a family that's Asian, how many 20-year-olds now conceptualize their future as, gee, maybe I want to work in Shanghai or Beijing or Seoul or Tokyo, even if you're yourself not Korean or ethnic Chinese. We have lots of people going over there to do work and to get involved in trade. Now, this is the interesting thing. By 2001, the percentage of ethnic Chinese in BC had reached pre-exclusion levels. Now, what happened is, in about 2001, ethnic Chinese became about 10% of the city and of BC. That was actually what the percentage was in 1901. And in 1880, it had been roughly 25%. In other words, this proportion of our total populations in Vancouver and BC, it was like that 100 years ago. And then something changed. And what changed was the rise of what at that time was self-consciously called White Canada. The very people who came off and stepped off the railroad that the Chinese helped build, many of them took a look around and said, what are all these Chinese and natives doing here? And so step one was to get rid of them. And so in 1885, at the very moment the CPR was finished, the anti-Chinese head tax was imposed. $50 head tax to come into Canada. That's equivalent to about a year's wages as a laborer. It was also the moment at that time, in the late 1870s through the end of the 19th century, that the reserve system began to be implemented, and then eventually residential schooling. So what you have is, in fact, a shift to kind of a nation that's going to start to organize itself, you could say, in places like British Columbia, that's built on the model of white supremacy. Now, it's an ugly part of our history, and I think most people who are educated and who have grown up here or who arrive from other places say, well, yeah, that's the past, and it's not a particularly nice past, and we should deal with it. One of the ways to deal with it, in fact, is to recognize that the world that got eclipsed, the world that got removed, erased, was, in fact, a world that we might recognize right now. a place where, as I said, back then 10% of the population of BC was ethnic Chinese, and now we're at that world again. So another way to think about this is that, in fact, when Chinese exclusion, in 1923 a law was passed to not allow any more Chinese into Canada at all, if that had not happened, think about where we would be at right now. That, in fact, what that did was it cut off a world that was developing and froze it in a kind of unreal time warp, you could say, this fantasy land that there was a white Canada just as there was a white Australia. And then when immigration laws were changed in 1967 to remove racial preference, to basically say, if you want to come and you're educated and you have professional skills, we'll take you. Once those laws were changed away from a white Canada immigration, funny thing happened. What we're living with now happened. And so those 40 years, you could say, between 1923 to 1967, 45 years, 50 years, say the half century, that's the aberration. That's the weird time in our history. That's the time when you had to pass a lot of laws to create a strange, unreal place called white Canada. You had to have laws that excluded Chinese. You had to have laws that cleared Native peoples off the prime real estate. You had to create a whole state bureaucracy, in other words, to implement this world. Now, if you arrived and you came after World War II from Hungary or Romania or Italy or Scotland, you arrived into a world where you didn't have to do anything to get the privileges of this world. You just arrived, and land was available. There's loans from banks for a mortgage to get a house. But if you were Chinese, that wasn't available. If you were Native, that wasn't available. So you walked into a place that basically had apartheid. No different in its legal form than South Africa. South Africa apartheid was about job discrimination. Only some jobs were open to non-whites. It was about housing segregation. Some areas were not open to non-whites. It was about voting exclusion, so non-whites can't vote. BC had all of those three. In fact, a little-known fact, when apartheid was being implemented in the early 20th century, the architects of apartheid looked to North America for the best examples. And the two best examples were the reserve system, implemented by the British in Canada, and Jim Crow segregation in the American South. Now, I say all this not because I'm a Canada basher or I hate Canada. In fact, I'm as patriotic a Canadian as you'll find. I was born here. I cried when the Canadians won the Olympic gold medal. I won't admit that too much. Was this on film? Okay. But I think one of the things that we have to deal with is this past. And as I said, it's an aberrational period. It's an exclusion period. So what does that mean? Oops, wrong button. One of the things is that we should rethink who we are in the city, and you could say also the nation in its entirety. Who are we? One is to stop thinking about immigration and instead migration. Now, why do I say that? Partly it's because immigration is a term, and the word immigrant is a really loaded term. Right? When I say immigrant, who do you imagine? Right? One of the things is if someone steps off the plane, now it's planes rather than ships, and they are coming from New York, right? Or Florida, and they happen to be, of European ancestry. Unless they sort of out themselves and say, oh, by the way, I was born in the United States, generally, you wouldn't think of them as an immigrant. But if they have black hair and they look, say, like me, then you often get asked, say from personal experience, hey, where are you from? And if you say, I'm from Vancouver, they say, well, where are you really from? Right? Like, what's your ancestry? Now, that idea comes from, in some sense, the idea that Canada was naturally for one set of people, and immigrants are those who arrived later. who don't quite belong. Why I think that's important is because we actually still have all kinds of ways of understanding ourselves in a place like Vancouver, in which the idea that, in fact, Chinese were here right from the beginning, it's not meaningful. So, for instance, we celebrated BC's 150th anniversary, a couple years ago, in 2008. It happened to be also the 150th anniversary of the first Chinese setting up permanent settlement in Victoria. The fact that the two were actually the same anniversary, it should tell us something. We're celebrating the 125th anniversary of Vancouver next year. It's also the 125th anniversary of Chinatown. Chinese are immigrants. That's just so natural. The idea is they're arriving, constantly arriving, late arriving. But if you're from the British Isles, it's sort of a quirky, interesting thing that you're an immigrant. You wouldn't label someone coming from the British Isles or from the United States if they were sort of non-visible minority, right? Or an invisible minority, so to speak. Okay. One of the things that you're seeing is that a lot of the people coming to a place like Vancouver now are circular migrants. They're migrants rather than immigrants in some sense. And this is another way I'll make an argument against the word immigrant, is that often now people come to Vancouver and they think of themselves as coming for school or their kids' schooling. So if you ask around people who've arrived and say, what are the number one reasons you've come, or top 3 reasons? Inevitably, if they have children, the opportunities for their children in schooling, that's right up there on the top of the list. Now, it's because we've got fairly good universities and fairly good public schools, and it's relatively safe here, and it's a nice place to raise kids, all those things. And as sometimes I would joke with my students, we also, even at a place at the UBC that's a top-notch university, we are perfectly capable of taking mediocre students who couldn't cut it in the exam systems of Taiwan or Korea. Right. Now, I say that to kind of get a rise out of my students because they're perfectly good students. I'm happy with them. But one of the things is often parents who they're raising kids and they're in some place where the exam environment and the kind of pressure to get to the top universities, and if you don't get into the right cram school, you're toast, and da-da-da. They see their kid at about the age 10, 11, they start to go, I don't think he's going to make it, or I don't think she's going to cut it. It's like, let's go to Canada because, it's easy to get into Simon Fraser or this or that, And people think this way. If you actually, take my word, if we've done oral histories and interviews and stuff, it's like, they say things like that. Oh, the kid's great, but we started to realize maybe we should take him to a place where it's easier to get him into a university, right? He just wasn't going to cut it, or she wasn't going to cut it in the exam system, right? So that's why I often taunt my students by saying that if you came here, your parents must have thought you were mediocre and tried to get you into it. But in any case, let me just kind of go down here and talk about that educational mobility as a concept. UBC undergraduates, just under 15% foreign students according to our stats. Now that means a foreign student who doesn't have Canadian PR status or citizenship. But if actually you scratch a little, those people, they pay around $16,000 for tuition, whereas if you're a PR or a citizen, it's $4,000. Well, actually, if you look at who's not born in Canada who arrived, it's closer to 30% and above were born outside Canada. Now, I'm not going to make a generalization and say everybody who was born outside Canada was coming because they were mediocre students and their parents wanted to get them into school. That's not true. But there's an incredibly high economic incentive to come here and be a PR rather than a foreign student. It's an incentive of about $12,000 difference. And $4,000 for tuition. It means that if you can get your kid into UBC or SFU, that's so much cheaper than a top-notch university in the United States or other places. So it's actually quite economically strategic to try to get your children into a good Canadian public university. And it's probably worth the cost of migrating. In fact, in Coquitlam, there's buildings full of Korean grandmothers who are there to take care of their grandkids while they go to high school and then university, while parents continue working in Korea, because you can make more money in Korea than you can in Vancouver. Bing Tom, the architect, once quipped that Vancouver would become the Switzerland of the Pacific. And what he meant by that was, Switzerland in Europe, it's where you send your kids to boarding school, right? You just get rid of them for a while. And it's also a place you park your money into Swiss bank accounts. Well, Vancouver, you don't need Swiss bank accounts. You have real estate. And I'll talk about that next. I'll talk about the business migrant thing later. Well, how about later is now? One of the things that's amazing about Vancouver is if you're a real estate speculator, I doubt it here, real estate just won't go down. Even when it corrects itself, you get worried, but in the end, that house, that condo, it just keeps going up and up and up. Because we've got clean air, it's a great location, limited amount of space, and it's the driving industry here, real estate. And unless you own one of the Olympic condos and are taking a bath with that, generally speaking, it's kind of hard. You have to be really bad at it to lose money in real estate here. If you buy and hold, in the long run, it keeps going up. Right? And historically, it goes all the way back to 1886. So, what do we have is, in fact, it's real estate. That's actually our Swiss bank account. That's our version in the Switzerland of the Pacific. And so, if you can pour money into real estate here, it's cheaper still for the same kind of real estate. Let's say you want a condo in Sydney on the edge of the harbor, near the Opera House. What's a 2-bedroom condo cost there compared to here on English Bay? You may think it's expensive for a 2-bedroom condo in English Bay overlooking the water, but once you compare it to other major global cities around the Pacific, it's still cheap. So, real estate. What you have is that Vancouver is becoming a place that has an attraction for people with money, who are mobile, and can migrate in circular patterns. And what I mean by circular patterns is that you can actually conceive of your life, and David Lay, my colleague in geography, has written a book called Millionaire Migrants, and what he was trying to capture were people who actually could conceive of their lives as, go to school here, graduate, go find a job in a place where you can actually get a job where you're rewarded for your skills rather than getting your UBC BA and then working as a barista at Starbucks for 4 years, which is what we actually condemn many of our 22-year-old graduates into if they want to stay here, is find a menial service job which pays you just above minimum wage, versus going to a place like Hong Kong, Shanghai, Singapore, Beijing, where you can get a job where you can rise very quickly and you can use the skills you've acquired. And then work somewhere globally in the world and just have nostalgia and pangs of wanting to return. And eventually when you're in your maybe mid to late 30s, and you want to settle down, have kids, or now you've gotten married and you've got young kids, and then claw your way back to Vancouver, all right? Take a pay cut if you have to, borrow money from mommy, daddy, whoever you can, so you can get a little piece of property, and then economically things kick back, right? Then that cheap public tuition for the high schools and universities, the good education system that's open to the public, all of a sudden those things kick back as being in your favor because you're trying to raise a young family instead of trying to make it as a 22-year-old in a place where your best opportunity is to make an espresso for people who have money. So why I'm sort of throwing that out is that it's also to get away, as I said, from the idea that immigrants are one-way movers. Because the other thing is, let's say you're a 4th-generation Vancouverite. If your son or daughter is in one of my classes, no matter if they're Chinese or whatever, they're thinking, what am I doing when I graduate? And they're going to be faced with that prospect. Right? What's the best job I can get with my UBC degree or SFU degree or whatever? What's the best job I can get here? What's the best job I can get, say, somewhere else, like China? And I think that's one of the things that's happening, is that we've become the kind of Switzerland of the Pacific, to use Bing Tom's phrase again. It's a place that's easier to spend money than to make money. And you'll find, again, that a lot of people will agree with that. It's like if I say, hey, it's a fantastic place to spend money. There's a coffee shop every half a block in this city, all right? And there's a restaurant every like 30 feet. But if you scratch into those restaurants, most of them are run by ethnic Chinese entrepreneurs who've come from somewhere else, and they'll tell you how hard it is to make money running a small restaurant, but it's better than anything else. Okay. The business migrant program, let me just go back there for a quick sec. Our actual immigration policy rewards this, in fact. And this is a neutral statement about our business investment and migration programs. But basically, in 1967, when racial exclusion was removed from our immigration policy, when White Canada effectively ended as an immigration policy, we created the point system. And the point system rewarded you for having education, it rewarded you for being in a good profession, lawyers, actually chefs too, it's why we have the best Chinese food in the world. It's rewarded you for being in a profession that Canada wanted. Well, that system worked very well. It attracted all kinds of people, a lot of them from Hong Kong and Asia. And then, basically in the late 80s, through pushing actually a lot from British Columbia and other provinces, wanted to target wealthy entrepreneurs who could invigorate our economy. And so the business migrant program was created, as well as the immigrant entrepreneur program. And at the time, basically the attraction was that if you could come here and invest $250,000, you would get fast-track citizenship. You wouldn't have to wait in the same lineup as the people going through the point system. Or if you hired X number of people. Now, $250,000 investment was actually quite a low bar, $250,000. Now it went up to $400,000, and now the Conservative government actually would like to push it up into $800,000. But still, in order to buy your way in, it wasn't so bad. Right? And it did invigorate the economy, the real estate economy. And in fact, one of the things that did happen was that the real estate market here has benefited greatly from offshore investment for all the kinds of reasons that I mentioned before. Okay, the Swiss bank account reason. Okay, what should we be doing? And this goes to the sort of teaser, like if this is the world we live in, how are we going to survive and thrive in the future? How should we learn to embrace who we are and embrace our future? A couple things. One is, when again you look at the statistics from the census, language, the mother tongue of people in Vancouver, Cantonese, 125,940. Chinese, which means that they checked off Chinese without specifying whether it was Mandarin or Cantonese, or 120,000. 114,000 Mandarin speakers. 69,000 checked off Taiwanese, a particular dialect. If you add those all up, and I have, that's actually quite a big proportion. It's not a majority, but it's a significant minority of people whose first language growing up was not English, and in fact was one form of Chinese. Punjabi is also up there. I'll just throw that out for a sec. 20% of Metro Vancouver population's first language, as I said, was some form of Chinese. Toronto, in comparison, was only about 8%, because Toronto's a bigger city. One of the things that I was involved in 3 years ago was we kind of marked the 100th anniversary of the anti-Asian riots in Vancouver. In 1907, there was a series of anti-Asian riots, anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese, anti-Punjabi Sikh down in Bellingham. And really that was one of the formative moments of White Canada. The slogan the rioters used was White Canada Forever. And when they said White Canada Forever, they meant forever in the future, but also forever in the past. and sort of erased inconvenient histories, such as the one I was mentioning about the Chinese being over here and First Nations peoples never really actually giving away their land, either by treaty or by defeat in battle. It sort of was just theirs, and then everybody else started squatting here. So that's why, in fact, right now we're undergoing historic treaty processes right now, because no one actually settled with Native peoples and said, by the way, this is no longer yours. And so legally, there's two ways in international law you can take someone's possessions or land or whatever. You can either beat them up, or you can have them sign a piece of paper and say it's yours. If you don't do either, you're just a squatter. So that's one of the things that we wanted to mark, is that this was this moment where it wasn't just about being anti-Chinese, anti-Japanese. These riots were about the creation of this weird thing called White Canada, and one of the things it involved was marking that and saying how far we've come. We're a better city, we don't do that stuff anymore, but it's part of our past. And one of the things we have to recognize is those parts of that past that we haven't gotten rid of. So what are the parts of the past? Well, one of the things we wanted to do was to actually initiate things like new teaching resources for students. So one of the things, we worked with the BCTF, and we said, hey, why don't, you're the teachers, let's not try to shove something down your throat, let's work with you. So the BCTF said, we'll create what ended up being this set of teaching resources called Pivotal Voices, which was to take multiple perspectives on our past, on not just the 1907 riots, but our whole early past in Vancouver, and say, what would it look like if you were a Japanese migrant? What would it look like if you were a Chinese migrant? What would it look like if you were a South Asian migrant? What would it look like if you were a migrant from Europe, right, or Eastern Canada? What would it look like if you were Musqueam, First Nations? And if you take it from that way, you'll see that the same event looks really different depending on which perspective you have. And then you let the student figure it out. You know, well, what do you think happened there? It's like a car crash, and you got 3 witnesses, and each of them says something different. Well, what actually happened? Right? Let the student try to figure it out. Don't sort of cram one version of the story down their throat and say, learn this one, and the rest doesn't matter. Because if you actually look at Chinese language newspapers from the time, which we did, and we said, it looks different. If you're Chinese and you're writing about it, you know, it's not about White Canada being built and this is a glorious moment of creating better rights and more egalitarian democratic forms of government. It was about, gee, you know, I'm in this job and there's these guys who want to drive me out. So one of the things that we did, as I said, was to work with teachers and just sort of say, okay, here's the historical evidence, you know, create lessons plans where you get the students to think. And one of the things that they found, and immediately because the BCTF helped create it and implemented it, it was adopted by 119 social studies 10 teachers right away. Because they liked it. They loved the idea that for the first time they could do something which didn't talk about Confederation and Louis Riel. I think a lot about Louis Riel and the Red River Rebellion, but all of a sudden there was something that was here. It was about something that happened here that might have relevance to the students. Because if you are a recent immigrant, quote, quote, to use that word, from China, you could say, yeah, actually, 100 years ago, if I was young, I might have seen the world this way. I actually was here. I belonged. It wasn't that the Chinese helped build the railroads, Chinese were here for the gold rush. What were they doing the rest of the time? Well, the rest of the time, they were in a society where they helped farm and create or grow produce to feed the city. Even now, if you drive along the old Southwest Marine Drive, you'll see Chinese farms that have been there 100 years continuously. They grew a lot of the produce. I'll give you an example. Everybody knows London Drugs and IGA. London Drugs' favorite place to buy cheap, good things. London Drugs is owned by the Louis family, and the Louis family originally made a lot of their money in moving produce from Chinese farms to Chinese grocery stores, where everybody would go to buy stuff from corner grocery stores. Okay. I was also involved, and this is something, an ongoing project, about circles to dialogue between First Nations, urban, Aboriginal, and immigrant communities. And this project was basically to look at who we are, and to create some dialogues. And this is not just about Asian, quote, immigrants, but recent arrivals. Like, what do you know of First Nations and who the Musqueam are and who Tsleil-Waututh is and who are the, the First Nations and Aboriginal peoples here? If you're not getting a lot of info. Right? And maybe also if you are Musqueam, how much info do you have about who the people who are arriving in this city, who are actually the demographic voting public for the future? So it was a set of dialogues just to open up, conversations about who we are for those perspectives. So I think what we're looking for, and I'm not pretending to know the answer, so I'm just throwing this out as, historically, this has been a complicated place, as I said, that's had migrants from across the Pacific, from across the Atlantic, and also First Nations and Aboriginal peoples for a long time. It's also where we are right now. Aboriginal peoples didn't go away. They didn't lose all their culture because of residential schooling, although the attempt was made to eradicate much of the language and culture of Native peoples, but they're still here. And so we have to deal with our past in order to have a common future. We have slogans like Vancouver is the Asia-Pacific Gateway. What that has meant up till now is generally a new bridge, a better coal facility to send raw materials to China and Japan. It's generally meant big infrastructure for trade. It hasn't meant things like human capital. Remember those figures about how many mother tongue, Cantonese, Mandarin, Philippines. If we want a global economy that's people, we trade with people across, why do we take a child who's born here and teach them only English and maybe a little French, and then eventually, when they get to college, and Ross King's here, who's the head of Asian Studies, we have a longer wait list for Mandarin in college than most universities have students taking Mandarin. We teach more students at UBC Mandarin than any other university in continental North America. Why? Because there's a demand, because people want to know these languages. And what do we do if you're 7 and you want to know these languages? Because the best time to learn a really difficult language, or to retain a really difficult language like Cantonese or Mandarin, is to keep going with it when you're young. Don't wait to have remedial language training when they're 21, where your brain is now not really suited as well anymore to learn a new language. Teach them when my 5-year-old, he picks up languages like, it's like water. It's so easy. So, one of the things about investing in our future is learn other languages, like Mandarin. And those who already have that as a family mother tongue, try to keep them, because they're going to be useful in our future. When a big percentage of our population speaks it, and when China, the growing economic giant, continues to loom larger and larger in our future. Edmonton, Alberta has 13 public schools with dual immersion, 50-50, half the classes in Chinese, half the classes in English. And I always say, how many do you think we have? And most Vancouverites say, well, we must have some. We don't have any. Right? And we're not going to actually have any, even though this last 2 years there was a movement for basically early start, first grade, K through 7 Mandarin education. There was this huge, parents started to ask for it. What they got was not the Edmonton model of dual immersion, where you learn both English and Chinese equally, so that by the time, we hope, when you're the 7th grade, and that's been proven by thousands and thousands of students in Edmonton in this 26-year-old program, that you have fairly good dual language skills. No, what we have is a language program that's going to be planned and implemented, where if you speak Chinese, Mandarin, you're not allowed into the program. It's for English speakers only, or non-Chinese speakers only. It makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to language experts. Best way to learn language is to talk a lot of it, and if you have native speakers to talk with, even better. So I'm bringing this up as to kind of sum up the end. What we need, in some sense, for our future is a better investment in human capital. Who are we? Go back to those census numbers. Who are we now? Who are we going to be? How do we invest in that future so that our young are going to be globally useful, because that's where they're going to get a lot of jobs, is unfortunately other places than here. And not just the United States. One of the places like I myself went was to go to the United States. Well, that's one venue. How about crossing the Pacific? How about going back and forth in circular ways? People are already doing it. Let's think and plan that way. How do we capture taxes from people so that we capture them during their prime productive years of 25 to 40, rather than getting them when they're young, when they don't pay taxes, and they're a drain on our resources, and when they're old, when they're not paying that much taxes and drain on resources? How do we actually start to conceptualize who we are as a society, depending on who it is that we are and what the motivations are for people to live in a place like Vancouver? So, I said, better off coming here as a 10-year-old. What does that mean? You're better off coming here as a 10-year-old than being born here. You're better prepared for the future. The reason is, if you came here as a 10-year-old from wherever, you're more likely to retain enough of your mother tongue, if you don't speak English, and so you can relearn or build upon that. If you're born here, you have very little chance of having enough of a family mother tongue to be able to build on it. You can do it, but it's easier if you come as a 10-year-old. And you'll also be able to speak English coming as a 10-year-old by the time you're 18, 19, 20, probably without any kind of accent that would mar you in the job market. That, to me, signals something really wrong with public policy and the way we conceive of who we are. If you have a whole society, it's worse off for you if you're born here than if you come as a 10-year-old in terms of your future prospects. There's something actually wrong with that. Okay. So one of the things, and I'll end with this, is that this city is entering into the realm of global cities. 40 years ago, we used to be known, and we used to know ourselves as the end of the tracks, the place where you got off at the end of the transcontinental railroad. And that was a perspective and a vision, again, of European migration, getting off in Halifax, and then getting on the train. You end up here, and you're sort of at the edge of the world. And over there is Asia, where in fact most of our history has contained people going the other way. It was the end of a boat ride, or the end of a transoceanic jet plane ride, and it was a very different meaning. So we're entering into a future, and we're already in that future, where we're, along with Sydney, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Hong Kong, we're cities where we have a significant mixture of European and Chinese and Asian, and the future rests basically on that mixture. Now, we're actually quite unique, though, even among those cities, because places like Los Angeles have larger absolute numbers of, in the term down there is Asian Americans, people of Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and other Asian. But in terms of our proportion, we're a half Asian city, almost half Chinese. That's actually quite unique. You can't name another city in the world, but in particular in North America, where the proportion of our city that is ethnic Chinese or Asian is so high. That makes us unique. And that, in some sense, is what we either build on or we fail to realize the potential of the city. Singapore, a city that's 85% ethnic Chinese of various sorts, has multiple language policy. So, every kid has to learn English. English is still very useful, will continue to be for a long time, but also another language. Either Mandarin or Tamil or Malay. We have a dual language policy, one that may work very well in other parts of the country, but our bilingual policy of English-French just does not work here. Now, whatever your politics are in terms of, do you believe in biculturalism, bilingualism, and in English-French, whatever your attitude towards that, in practice, the resources that are put into places like Vancouver and British Columbia for bilingual English-French education does not produce bilingual speakers very effectively. In fact, we should be investing in the other things, who we are as a city in those demographic ways. I'm going to end there because I hope that that I hope is that I'm not preaching to the converted and everybody's just going to say, okay, whatever, I already knew that and walk away. That there will, as Ira said, be a little fight on this. I welcome it just because I think it's important that we start this conversation. And it's just insane to me in some sense that we aren't dealing with this as a dialogue that's a civil society dialogue about who are we. It's funny because one of my colleagues now, and right here, whenever I said the word or the phrase white supremacy, they got this shiver and they would like giggle. And I she told me this, and I kept on, and so I asked her, well, why does it make you giggle? She said, well, South Africa had white supremacy. The American South had white supremacy. The idea that Canada had white supremacy. We are the people that go and tell other people how to run their lives and how to be better. And we're here, we go out into the world and we're the good guys. But in fact, the history I've talked about, it's not some source of shame to me as Canadians. We should just deal with it and move on and build a world together that's a better, fairer world that takes advantage, literally, of who we are. And so I'll end with that. And next week, I'll just put a plug in. Ross King and Duan Duan Lee are basically the people in arts who run Asian language instruction. And they'll tell you about the number of students who are demanding Asian languages. They'll tell you about this incredible strategic thinking that our young have. That my students, they ask themselves, what the heck am I going to do after I graduate? And increasingly, things like having an Asian language, having the opportunity and possibility of being able to go globally and get jobs in sort of Asian economies, it's part of the calculations. And even if they decide not to and stay here, it's still in their mind useful to be able to speak Japanese, Chinese, Korean, any slew of Asian languages. Why, in some sense, it's so crucial. It was crucial in the past, and the last thing I'd say is 100 years ago, many of the people who were from Chinese Canadian families, they taught their kids how to speak both Cantonese and English, if they could, because you never know what's going to be useful to the kid. And armed with those two languages, you were better off than if you only spoke English. So, thank you for listening on a Wednesday night, and I hope, as I said, there's some fight over this. Thanks, Anne.
Question, yeah. We have some time for questions, or declarations, or if you have a manifesto at hand that you'd like to deliver, this is your opportunity. Yes, sir.
I was born in 1940, so I've been around a long time, seen a lot of things change. One of the things that I want to mention is that there is a mix, because I have a son and a daughter, and another daughter. So there's three, but my son married an English girl, so they're half Chinese, I think. Okay, my daughter married an English girl, so but they have no children. I also have, to demonstrate what you're saying about the circular migration, is a niece who learned Chinese because her mother was in Shanghai. She married my brother-in-law. Okay. But they learned Chinese. She's gone back to Hong Kong and got a job there. Okay, and is raising a family there also. Okay. So there's this circular thing. Her husband is also there, but he was also from that region. So there is this mix that's going on. So I don't even know what's going to happen. But I hope it would be good. And I can't agree with you more about what you said about language. Okay, all of the things I retained a little bit about language, but I wish I had kept it all. And I wish my kids had learned it, but they haven't learned it.
Thank you. It's funny because if I could be certain that you wouldn't just get up and leave, I would keep on haranguing you about other senses of half Asian, which is literally just what you've brought up. I'm writing a book also that hopefully will be done sometime next year called How Tiger Woods Lost His Stripes, which is in fact about it means something different now than it did when I first came up with the title. Let's just put that aside. But sex is in there, but not quite in the way that I imagined a little while ago. But one of the things about Tiger Woods, obviously, that made him famous, other than being an amazing golfer, was that racial mixture of being part this, part that, and really that part Asian part was, because African Americans have been, mixed in all kinds of ways for a long time. It was the fact that, the mother was Thai that really, made it the tiger part, the part yellow, part white, or part black, or whatever tigers are. So one of the things I think that makes us unique as well in this city is the number of mixed couples. Now, when I say mixed, I don't just mean like by race. I mean people mix. And the reason why is that we are geographically non-segregated. I can't tell you how important it is from the point of view of, say, anthropologists. There's a term that anthropologists use called propinquity. And if you don't know what that means, propinquity is, what are your real chances of mating with someone? Propinquity is how many chances you get. Like what's the field of choices for your mating? Generally, the best places to find a mate are school, work, and everything else, like the place you work out, the store you shop at, meeting someone at a wedding. Everything else drops down below that. Work, school. So one of the things about segregation and apartheid is if you can keep people segregated at work and at school, they won't breed with each other. Right? That's why in a social reproduction, sexual reproduction kind of formula, if you want to keep people apart and you want to keep them over generations apart, don't let them go to school or work together. Because if they do, the inevitable happens and they get together and they have kids and they start mixing and creating. We, in Vancouver, there's not a single neighborhood that does not have some proportion of it that's of Chinese and ethnic Asian background. Even Kitts, which I've often mocked for being the sort of the whitest place in Vancouver, and it is. You look at the census, Kitts is the whitest place in Vancouver. But even Kitts has some Chinese and some Asians, just not as many as other places. Compare this to other North American cities. If you go to Los Angeles and you wander around West LA, which is where I used to live, you could go blocks and blocks without running into someone Chinese. And then you go to Monterey Park, and Monterey Park is like Richmond. It's 60-something% Chinese. Toronto, you can wander around lots of areas and never run into someone Chinese. But if you go to Markham or Scarborough, it's like 65% ethnic Chinese. So what you have there is, in fact, not de facto segregation in terms of legal apartheid. Nobody's making Chinese live in Scarborough. But what you have is residential enclaves and schooling enclaves, therefore. And so as people go to high school, who are they going to make mates with? And so one of the interesting things about Vancouver is you look at our schools, and particularly our high schools, and they're highly mixed. Right? Our universities are highly mixed. Our workplaces are highly mixed. And so what you get is mixed families. And so the half Asian part of it means that literally we have children again and again and again you run into, and they're like part Asian, part this, part whatever. It could be part Mennonite, part this. We mix people here, residentially and in our workplaces. And so, again, that's actually not that common in North America. Most North American cities are actually residentially segregated by race, in particular in the United States.
Yeah.
My parents came from Scandinavia back in the early 20s.
Yeah.
And when they moved here, they moved into, let's say, a ghetto, or into an area where all the people there, they spoke, Scandinavian of some sort. They were Swedes or Finns or Norwegians or whatever.
Yep.
And most of them worked in the mines or the woods. They didn't, when you're talking about the white supremacy part, they were white, but they were not supreme. They were down as as you're describing, Chinese are today, or the Asians, or others, could be South Americans. I wouldn't call it so much as a white supremacy as perhaps an English or an English language supremacy, such as, well, the Americans came up here like for the mining and for the gold rush, and the English came also when they originally came for that purpose. So there was the language, I think, was more of the segregation than it was of visual color. And I know it wasn't until my parents, they moved out to Richmond, and they got to speak English out there with the help of people in that area. They became part of the society. And I see that happening with the migration from Asia, that it's not the first generation. They move together because of the comfort of the language. They move to an area where there's other Chinese or other East Indian or South Asians, whatever, Philippine. They move into these enclaves, and then when they move out into another general population of a mix, then they become, and then as you mentioned through schooling, they then become part of. But until that point, it's not the recent arrivals that get mixed in. They stay pretty well as they are, and it's the children and the children's children that then become part of the general society.
I have no quibble with anything you said, except I'd point out one thing, which is that the kind of residential clustering and enclaves that you described is a migration phenomenon. When people move, they often tend to go live with and be supported mutually by other people, especially with language. So if you're speaking Swedish, then others who came from the same area who speak a similar form of language, of course, you see this all over the place. And so what you're describing is very much a migration phenomenon. One of the things about white supremacy is you don't have to be a racist or a white supremacist. You don't have to wear KKK robes. You don't have to be going around, saying all kinds of racist things in order to benefit from it. Now, I'm not saying, therefore, that anybody from Europe who had white skin benefited from white supremacy. What it is you've got a history in BC where if you were Chinese before 1947, you could not vote. If you were South Asian, you could not vote. If you were Native before 1960, you could not vote. Now, if you stepped off whatever boat or plane, and you were from, you mentioned Scandinavia, it may be that you're still really fighting it just to survive. You're having to work on a really difficult menial labor job. But you were immediately accorded political rights that someone who, say, was born here, who was categorized as Chinese, did not have. Now, what I want to avoid as a historian is comparative discrimination in some sense of who had it worse. A calculus of, I point out the voting because that's actually crucial for understanding how BC developed. If you looked at most unionization, it was created around white supremacy. It was only in the 1940s when things like the Woodworkers Union started to say, let's organize all workers, not just white workers. And one of the interesting things that happened in the woodworking industry, for instance, is that before that moment, if you were Punjabi or you were Chinese, you were thought of as, no citizen, you're not going to vote, you're not going to help us put the right politician up into power. And so let's use white supremacy politically. And so what often happened, sort of say as a kind of historical context, is that before the 1950s and 60s, white supremacy was just the air people breathed. It was the political makeup of the society. And it left a lot of legacies. One of which was when lots and lots of people started to come here after World War II, who were not, as I said, from the British Isles. And they had come here since the 1890s, basically, from places like Scandinavia. But after World War II, when you had a lot of people coming in who were from other places around the world, they just walked into a world where the Chinese were in Shaughnessy, but only as cooks and butlers. And they couldn't be engineers. They walked into a world where the Chinese couldn't be doctors. They couldn't be dentists. They couldn't be in any profession. And the reason why is because you couldn't be a professional unless you could vote. And if you couldn't vote, then you couldn't be any of those things. And so it's not about who suffered more, it's about a kind of structure that had that. Now, Anglo-dominance, which is what you're describing as the use of the English language, it was not the same as white supremacy, but it reinforces it a lot of the time. It also meant that if you didn't speak English and came from Europe, you had to get rid of your accent and get rid of whatever language you spoke. But if you think about what's motivating that, on the one hand, it's because English is the dominant language. But on the other, it's also because in order to look like you're one of the people who was in a Molson Canadian commercial, I mean, think of those beer commercials. Right? This is Canada, Molson Canadian commercial. And if next time you see a Molson Canadian commercial, just look who's in that commercial and who's missing from that commercial. The American equivalent I used to use when I taught at UCLA was the show Friends, which hopefully no one watches anymore. But you ever watch Friends? There's this show about the group of friends in New York, right? And and you look at it and going, I've been to New York. This ain't New York. They're all white, right? And there's this fantasy that this is America, and there's also this fantasy this is Canada, that Canada is a Molson Canadian commercial. And what happened there is it's English-speaking, or French-speaking if you're in one part of the country, but it's white. And so it's not something that white supremacy in Canada was very different, you could say, for most people who experienced it. That if you were, quote, a invisible majority, you were just normal. If you were a visible minority, then you were different. You were abnormal. You're not in the commercial. And that's one of the ways that race worked here, white supremacy worked, and how it wasn't always the same as language dominance, Anglo dominance in the English language, and yet the two often worked hand in hand historically. So, in fact, I think everything you've said is absolutely true. In fact, I would say that when I was growing up as a child, and there was someone who would call me a name or something in school, often it would be someone who spoke English with an accent who would come to my defense. It would be someone who spoke with a Hungarian or a Romanian or Italian accent and come and say, hey, and they would basically identify with me precisely for the reasons you outlined, which is they had felt the sting of a kind of English dominance that kind of put them on a lower level. And so, to me, that's the wonderful thing about Canada, is that, in fact, we have a lot more hope for a common future together, both because of what the gentleman said about mixing, but also because racism isn't the same as Anglo-dominance, but for much of our history, they worked hand in hand. But it also allows for these kinds of cross-linguistic, cross-ethnic identifications with each other, saying, my parents came from Sweden, Scandinavia, and they fought hard for everything they got. And that's what I see the guy who comes from China or Vietnam or the Philippines. They're just working hard, and I recognize that in my own family history, and we're all Canadians in that way. And it looks so different from the Molson Canadian commercial. So, yeah, that'd be... Yeah.
I'm going to just allow one more question. We're getting on to 7:15. I don't like to keep people. Yes?
I'm here, so yes. I'm trying to, follow what you're saying, trying to get us to think outside the box. Have I done this right, that even if Vancouver become a world city, we need to develop a population that has more language ability? Mm-hmm. And, well, when I read this title, Our Future is a Half Chinese City, Lessons from History, I assumed that it was going to talk about what's going to happen to the city of Vancouver's dynamics when there's more and more visible minorities. Will undercurrents pop up as they have in Europe? That's what I keep looking for. And
so you want the answer to that question? Are we going to have racial problems?
Well,
is that what?
I was born, just a little bit of history. I was born in Vancouver, and my dad was a laundry person, and we grew up in Chinatown. I was in grade 3, we moved uptown. My dad moved us so that my brother wouldn't become a gangster in Chinatown. Anyways, my first day at school, I was the victim of some racial problems, And I think maybe that's what made me determined to, really develop myself. And when I became president of grade 12 of high school. The girl that shunned me in grade 3 was trying to be my friend. You know? So that's part of my history. Now, my 3 girls are married to 3 Scotsmen.
Yep.
But I keep reading about this racial problems in Europe, so I'm wondering,
Yeah. Are we going to have those problems?
are the Canadians going to get a little more uncomfortable when there's more and more of these minorities, especially now that they've been chancellors of
Yep.
universities and
Do you want, thank you for that question. And I think I was thinking of giving that version of the talk, but I'll tell you why I didn't. Because to me, it was no. The simple answer is no. And it's not because I'm some eternal optimist. I grew up, as I said, also not quite in the same era, perhaps, and there was less racism against visible minorities, but I know that world. When my parents, we moved out to Victoria and outside Victoria, and there was 3 Chinese Canadian families and 1 Punjabi Sikh family and 2 Native families, and then everybody else was mixes of Scots and everything like that. But in one sense, to me, that world is gone, actually. I'll tell you the moment it actually left. Vancouver. Remember, for those of you who are here, Vancouver is the most Asian. It's being taken over by Hong Kong Chinese, and there you had newspaper editorials. The amazing thing about that moment is not that it happened. It's that it lasted so little time, and it was so isolated to certain parts of the city. If you recall, the most vocal were people who lived in Kerrisdale and Shaughnessy, and certain areas that had been bastions of white supremacy in terms of residential. It doesn't mean if you were living in Shaughnessy you were a white supremacist. It's just that Shaughnessy had things called housing covenants. The title of the house would have a clause that said, don't sell to Jews, don't sell to Chinese, and don't sell to natives. You can't. It's legally bound. Now, no one would often enforce that, but everybody knew that if you were not white, you shouldn't be in Shaughnessy unless you were a servant. So that world you're describing, it existed. It's exactly the world that you're describing as part of the growing up as Chinese Canadian. But for all the reasons that was part of the answer about the mixing now, that world is, in some sense, gone and not coming back. And the reason why it's not coming back is, and this is where I'd say, it's not because we're all better people now, although I like to think we are. Historically, what it is enough shifted and changed that world's not coming back. That 50 years, from 1920 to 1967, you could fantasize about creating a world that was white Canada, even though there was all these people who weren't, quote, white, and there's other people who actually were speaking all kinds of funny languages. You could fantasize about that world really working. And then you returned back to a world that was already developing before 1923. And the reason why I'm hopeful, you could say, that we're never going back to that world is because there are chancellors that are Chinese Canadian, that there's economic power here now. There are 3 councillors on our city council who are ethnic Chinese. There are owners of companies. 37% of UBC is ethnic Chinese. You're not getting rid of those guys, right? You're not going to resegregate Shaughnessy, because who's going to buy all those houses that the rich Chinese own in Shaughnessy to get rid of them? You're not going to resegregate Kerrisdale, because you have to get rid of all the best restaurants in Kerrisdale, right? You're not going to resegregate the British properties, because some of our wealthiest... Exactly. And what are you going to do? Split your grandchild in half and say, we got to get rid of the Chinese part of him or her? So what's happened is we've developed in a society to the point where that's no longer going to happen. But going back to the gentleman's point about English dominance, one of the legacies of our colonial past is English dominance. And it wreaked a great amount of emotional violence among people who really lost a sense of who they were. And the first example, that's the best example, is residential schooling for Native children. That kind of violence about you cannot speak your native language, you can only speak English, it's incredible the kind of psychic and psychological and emotional damage it wreaks. But that kind of damage is also there still in families that have mother tongues that are other than English, and often gaps between grandchildren and grandparents because of language differences and stuff. So I would say the world that you're describing, no, it's not coming back. Not here.
I'm going to jump in at this point, and first of all, I couldn't think of a better moment to pause. This lecture isn't really ending, it's continuing. But you'll have to come back on Wednesday of next week to hear Ross and do it and to discuss this very issue that Henry has just concluded with, and that's the question of language education in British Columbia in particular. It'll be a very exciting talk. Please join us again, but more importantly, join us in thanking Henry for a very stimulating presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Violet. Thank you.